change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Acts. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we left the Apostle Paul unable to receive justice as a Roman citizen in the lower Roman courts, where after 2 years in custody and imprisoned at the palace in Caesarea, and after 2 court trials before 2 Roman governors, and with 1 hearing before a king, Paul has now appealed to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman, where at this time the emperor was Nero. So now Paul is being transported as a prisoner in chains, and he's given into the custody of a Roman centurion named Julius. And here we're told that he's not Julius's only prisoner, but he is the only prisoner who has appealed to Caesar for a new trial in Caesar's appellate court. Because it says here, some other prisoners. The Greek word here means others of a different kind, which means that these other prisoners have already been convicted. And these are those who have committed capital crimes who are on their way to be executed. And so you may wonder, and you say, well, why are they being transported to Rome to be executed? Because couldn't Rome have executed them in their own local provinces? Well, the answer to that is yes. But where would be the fun in that? Because these condemned prisoners are most likely being transported to Rome to die in the arena, like the kind of games that they used to have in the Colosseum. But at this time, the Colosseum hadn't been built yet. It'll be built in 81 AD, so it's not too far off in the future. But these prisoners will probably die by either wild animals or by gladiators for Rome's entertainment. And Paul here, he'll have a long time to get to know these men. So they're going to probably hear all about the salvation found in Jesus Christ. And then here in verse 2, it says that they entered in a Dramaton ship, which only means where the ship is from, which is by the island of Lesbos in Western Asia. So this would be a smaller freighter grain ship. It's the kind of ship that would have had just one small square sail that wouldn't be able to sail against the wind. So this ship would be about 140 feet long and 36 feet wide. And it wouldn't have a rudder, but it would have just 2 paddles in the back to steer with. And these ships were used to deliver supplies up and down the coastline, and they weren't made for the open seas. And so what Julius is doing here by traveling on these smaller ships is that he's trying to get to a larger city where he can find a ship that's large enough to go straight to Rome. So it's kind of like taking those little hopper flights, trying to get to a larger airport to get a non-stop flight. Where these larger type ships, you can't even find them in the smaller cities. So you can't even find them in the cities like Caesarea. And then we also hear in verse 2 where we read, we put to sea, which means that Dr. Luke, in his humble way, he's saying that he's going with Paul. And this is probably as his personal physician. And it's not only Luke that's with Paul, but we also see that Aristarchus is probably going along as Paul's assistant, where Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, he mentions Aristarchus as being a fellow prisoner. But here with Aristarchus, on his part, it was all voluntary. Okay, so now they sail on the smaller ship 80 miles to Sidon. And Sidon is in Lebanon. And that would have taken them about a day and a half. And then in Sidon, Paul was given the freedom to meet with other believers who provided for Paul and his crew. Where then from Sidon, they sailed to Myra, which we see here that the winds, they're already bad for sailing. And that's why they're sailing between the island of Cyprus and the mainland, because they usually would sail on the outside of Cyprus. And then when they get to Myrna, which is in Turkey, Julius the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, which means it's from Alexandria, Egypt. And this ship was going straight to Italy. Were this ship too, it would be taking grain to Rome, because Egypt at this time was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, where it produced a lot of their grain. And so this is a large ship for its day. And so it's about 180 feet long and 45 feet wide. And so this ship would be able to handle the open seas. So this ship is not only carrying the grain for Rome, but it also has enough room to carry these 276 passengers that come on board. And what you need to realize here is that they're taking off late in the year. This is toward the end of sailing season, because the westerly winds have already began to blow. And so their travel is slow, where it tells us it took them many days to get to Fair Havens, which is on the island of Crete, which is usually only a short trip, where Fair Havens is about 500 miles from Myra, but here it's taken them about 15 days. And so now, with this ship at the port at Fair Havens, everybody's aware that they're not going to make it to Rome this year, not before the winter has passed. Because here we're told that the fast is already over. And the fast that they're talking about here is Yom Kippur. They're talking about the Jewish Day of Atonement, where the actual date of this actual year would have been October 5th in the year of 59 AD, where any time after September 14th, it was always dangerous to sail on the Mediterranean Sea. And it will stay that way, and it'll remain dangerous up until November 11th. But then after November 11th, all sailing is shut down, because after November 11th, the sea became impossible to sail. And it stays that way until after February. And for some reason, Paul, he is being brought into this discussion on moving the ship, where Paul, he's not an expert on sailing, but Paul does have a lot of experience on being shipwrecked, because we know from 2 Corinthians 11 that had already been written by this time, Paul has already survived 3 shipwrecks, where he spent one time a whole day and a night in the sea waiting to be rescued. And so at this time, Paul, he's been on at least 11 ship journeys, and he's traveled over 3,500 miles by sea. But for most, Fair Havens is not the kind of port that you want to harbor your ship in for the winter, with one of the reasons being it's just a small town, so there's not much to do in the winter. But it also has a shallow harbor, and it's open to the sea, and so it receives a good brunt of the winter storms. And so Paul, he has a word of warning for them. And here he doesn't say it's from God, but that doesn't mean that it's not from God, because all of what Paul says here would have come true if God had not intervened. But here in verse 10, the Greek word that Paul uses here for perceived, it means to perceive from past experience. So Paul, he perceives from his past experience that there will be a loss of cargo, the ship, and their lives. But the ship owner and the ship's captain, they don't see it that way. And they're the experts here. And so Julius the centurion, who's in charge, he'd rather listen to them, because they're only going to try to go 40 miles to Phoenix, which is just around the corner on the island of Crete, which would only take them a few hours. So this is sort of a 3-hour tour. But we've seen from Gilligan's Island that a 3-hour tour can end up quite crazy, where it didn't really work out for the skipper, Gilligan. But Phoenix, it was a larger town, and it had a deeper port with more protection from the storms. And so Paul, his advice is disregarded, and it seems to them that they made the right decision, because the weather did change and things began so perfectly, where here it looks like Paul was wrong. where now they have this gentle, soft wind beginning to blow from the west. It's just exactly what they needed. But then this soft wind turns into a tempestuous wind. And a tempestuous wind, that's where we get our word typhoon. And this one is called a Euroclydon, which is a hybrid word that's made up from two words. One of the words is Latin and the other one is Greek, which means a northeasterner, which means it's a hurricane. This is a storm that's impossible to steer. And though they were just traveling around the coast of Crete, it's now impossible to return to the island, where the ship is now driven into the open seas. And so what they do is they just let the ship go, and they just let it drive itself. Where at this point, the ship has now drifted 23 miles toward the island of Clauda, where now the skiff, which is that little dinghy boat that they tow behind the ship, it's now become a liability to them because it's crashing into the main ship, and it's causing enough damage to make a shipwreck. And so now they pull it on board, where at this time, they're working hard just to keep the ship afloat. And so now they're wrapping chains and ropes around the hull of the ship just to hold the ship together. And they're going so fast where because of their speed, they're afraid of getting shipwrecked on these sandbars off of the shallow Gulf of North Africa called the Syrtis Sands. And so they take down their sails, and then it says they struck sail. And what struck sail means, it means that they threw an anchor over the stern of the ship to slow the ship down. All right, so the next day, they throw out everything personal overboard except for some of the grain, because they have to lighten the ship just to stay afloat. Where then on the third day, where it says we, so Luke and Paul, they're helping here, where it says that they threw the ship's tackle overboard, which means if this storm ever ends, they will have no way of steering the ship, because that's what ship tackle does. But they have no choice. It's either lighten the ship or sink. And they haven't seen the stars or the sun for days, which means that they have absolutely no idea where they are, because they always navigated by the stars. Because all the ancient navigational equipment, it hasn't been invented yet. So the only way that they knew how to navigate was by the position of the stars, by the position of the sun, where to them it seems that the storm will never end, with days of darkness, with no one eating, because if they did eat, they wouldn't be able to keep it down anyways because of the seasickness. And so it's just one wave hitting them after another. And then we get to the saddest verse of this whole passage, where it says, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Where this means everyone, where everyone here is thinking, we're going to die. Where here it even says, we. So that means this is how Luke feels, and this is even how the Apostle Paul feels. Where even these great Christian believers, these men of faith who know God and who are known by God, where even the great Apostle Paul has given up all hope of being saved. And I don't know if you ever thought you were going to die, but I came close once, and that was in January of 2018, when living in Hawaii, when the Hawaiian government, they sent out this emergency alert saying, with this text saying, ballistic missiles threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. But that wasn't even like this here, where their hope has been slowly drained away, where you're living with this dread for days and days. And many of us will go through storms like this in our lives, where this is not just a regular storm. This is greater than that. This is more than just going through tough times. This is where there's no hope. This is the kind of storms that overwhelms us that we can't survive. And we see those kind of examples all throughout the Bible. We saw that Job, that he had that kind of a storm where he wished that he had never been born, and he meant it, where he longed for death. And then David, before he became king, He had given up all hope, believing that Saul would one day kill him, even though he had the promise of being king. Or the disciples in the boat crying out to Jesus during their storm, "Don't you care that we're perishing?" We're here, it's the same. Because Paul here, he had a promise to see Rome, but he still lost his hope. Where the surviving of these storms or these types of trials in life, they have nothing to do with us. Where survival has nothing to do with our faith. Because the only way to get through these storms is that God brings us through them. Where it's not our faith, but it's God's faithfulness. Where it's not that we have such a grip on God, but that God has his grip on us. And you have to see here, none of this is because Paul is in any kind of disobedience. It's not like he's running away from God's will. He desires God's will. So it's not like he's backslidden. But the fact is that Paul here, that he's in the middle of God's will, and God has not only allowed this, but God, he's still the one who's in control here, and he's guiding the ship. And so you might ask, well, why does God allow this if we're being obedient to God and if we're walking in his will? And that's because what we learn here are these priceless things about God through these storms that we can learn in no other way. Where these kind of storms in our lives, they can be anything. They can be things like a broken marriage. They can be things like your health or your children. They're storms where you see no hope, where you know that you will not survive it. But God, he uses these storms in our lives to give us character, perseverance, and a humility. It gives us a depth of relationship with our commitment to God. And we learn to be more caring of other people and more sympathetic than we ever have before. Because the truth is, in these storms, we do make it, though we never thought we would. And it's not because we have a grip on God or our faith. It's because we learn that God, he has a grip on us. Where these kind of storms, they purify our faith. All right, so Romans 5:3. But we also glory in tribulations, knowing that our tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Where Paul here, he has even lost his hope because he feels that God's absent. But the storm here, it doesn't get the final word. God does. Where sometimes it might feel like we've been abandoned by God, but it's actually the opposite. And so here are a couple of scriptures that remind us of God's faithfulness to us, with one being Philippians 1:6. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And that's what Paul wrote to the Philippian church. But you have to realize that he only wrote that after he went through this storm, because that letter was written when he was imprisoned in Rome. And so you have to think, well, where do you think he learned that from? And then you have 2 Timothy 2:13, where it says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. Where you learn that none of God's deliverances, they've ever depended on our faith. They've always been dependent on God's faithfulness. He's the one who gets us through the storms. So we bring nothing to the table. It has nothing to do with our faith, but it has all to do with God's faithfulness. And it doesn't even matter if we believe these promises, because God, he believes these promises. He does. And so Paul, then he tells his I told you so. So he has his I told you so moment. And I don't know if this is really such a great time for Paul to say to all these perishing people that I told you so. But what it seems that he's saying here to these people when he says, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete. What he's saying is that you should have listened to me then, but I'm only bringing that up so that you will listen to me now. Because if they listen to Paul now, there will be no loss of life, but only of the ship. Where we see here in Paul's hopelessness, God sent Paul an angel to encourage him. Where the very first thing that this angel says to Paul is, do not be afraid. And that's because Paul, too, he had lost all his hope. And Paul, he was very afraid. And then this angel encourages Paul by reminding Paul of what Jesus actually said to Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And then that angel, he tells Paul that God is going to answer your prayer, that God has granted you all those who sail with you. So all these people that Paul has been interceding for, they're all going to be saved. And then Paul said, therefore, which means because of what all the angels said there, he says to them, he says, take heart. And then Paul, he gives them the bad news, where Paul tells them what will happen. And this is a prophetic word because it really does come to pass, where they will be shipwrecked and they will run aground on a certain island. But they're not told the name of the island here. And so it doesn't seem like it here, but God, he is directing the ship. But even after Paul's encouraging words, this storm, it doesn't end. Because we read here that it says the 14th night, but then something happens to change, where they're taking these soundings, and then they're finding out that they're approaching land way too quickly. And so they drop 4 anchors to slow them down before they hit the rocks. And then some of the sailors, they try to steal that skiff, which means it's because of their unbelief. But then they're told that all hands were needed for them to survive. So Paul tells the centurion, and you can see here that Julius, he's starting to believe Paul, where he has the ropes cut that are holding the skiff. That all happened at the night. But when morning comes, Paul, he encourages everyone to eat something, because these guys, they haven't eaten anything in 2 weeks, and they're going to need their strength. And then he tells them again that they're all going to survive. And then he gives thanks and he breaks the bread in the Jewish custom. And then with all of them believing Paul, they throw the rest of the grain into the sea to lighten the ship. Then they see the land and a beach, and they don't know where they are, but now they're going to make their final attempt to make it to that beach. And so they let go of those 4 anchors, and at the same time, they raise the sails to try to get enough speed to drive the ship into the ground. And it worked, but the ship, it didn't make it to shore, but it was caught on the rocks and became unmovable. And we're told that it's where 2 seas meet. So there's these 2 seas that are battling it out, where now these waves are breaking the ship apart. And all they can do is jump ship and try to make it to land. And so now you got the soldiers, and they come up with their plan to kill all the prisoners on board, because they know that if any of them escape their guard, they're going to suffer the same consequences as their prisoner. And you have to remember that all of these prisoners, except for Paul, are to be executed. But because the centurion in charge, because he's become Paul's friend, he wants to save Paul. And so he doesn't allow it, and he finds parts of the ship to be used as floats for those who can't swim. And so he does all of those things at risk to himself, and they all make it. And now this shipwreck, we know that this shipwreck, it occurred in November. And then they find out that this island is Malta, which is a small island off of Sicily.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,